The year was 2017, and the small town of Ashford, Oregon, was shaken to its core by a string of brutal murders that would eventually reveal the dark undercurrents lurking in the lives of Lily Walters and her partner, Josh Harris. For months, the residents of Ashford lived under a cloud of fear as news spread of four local women who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Their faces, once vibrant and alive in school yearbooks and family photo albums, now peered down at passersby from the haunting missing posters plastered around town. Each woman's disappearance seemed to blend seamlessly with the next, all fitting a haunting pattern of young, single women who lived alone and had little to no family nearby. But there was no clear suspect, no hint of who could be behind such calculated cruelty. The first body was discovered on the outskirts of town, near the dense thickets of the North Ashford woods. When hikers stumbled upon the gruesome scene, authorities were quick to arrive. What they found was a chilling spectacle. The victim was bound, bruised, and marked with symbols carved into her skin, indicative of a meticulous and ritualistic cruelty. Detectives combed through the evidence, noting similarities with other missing persons cases. Soon, the forensic analysis confirmed the worst: they were dealing with a serial killer. As the investigation deepened, detectives began piecing together a timeline and modus operandi that suggested two killers rather than one. While Josh Harris had taken care of the physical brutality, signs of a secondary accomplice soon emerged. There were indications that the second person had a different, possibly supportive role. The nature of the wounds and the specific arrangements of the crime scenes hinted at someone involved in logistics, careful and deliberate, perhaps an orchestrator who knew exactly how to cover their tracks. Despite the mounting evidence, no leads surfaced until an unexpected turn of events occurred. Nearly 2 weeks after the fourth victim was found, Lily Walters walked into the Ashford Police Department and confessed to the murders, claiming she could no longer live with the horror of what she had done. She sobbed and painted a picture of a forced accomplice, someone who had been threatened and coerced, who had lived under the crushing control of a manipulative and abusive partner, Josh Harris. She claimed Josh had been the mastermind, and she, merely a helpless pawn, was drawn into the violence out of fear for her own life. However, what at first seemed to be a straightforward confession quickly unraveled under scrutiny. While Josh had indeed died by suicide shortly before her confession, details of her story failed to line up with the evidence gathered. Lily's recollection of events seemed both calculated and inconsistent, casting doubt on the degree of her involvement and whether her role had been as passive as she claimed. The police were left questioning whether they were dealing with a victim or a willing participant in a string of horrific murders. Detectives assigned to the case were unconvinced by Lily's claims of innocence, sensing a calculated attempt to minimize her role in the brutal murders. Evidence collected from the crime scenes and later from the couple's shared apartment began to paint a different picture, a narrative of two people enmeshed in a shared thrill for violence rather than a victim and her abuser. Lily's fingerprints were found on duct tape, ropes, and even on one of the victim's clothing, casting further doubt on her claim of being a mere bystander. In their apartment, investigators uncovered journals and a variety of chilling artifacts that hinted at the meticulous planning involved. One journal, inscribed with detailed sketches of each crime scene, suggested that whoever made the drawings had taken pleasure in planning each step of the killings. More disturbing, the handwriting and artistic style were later confirmed to belong to Lily, not Josh. Notes included cryptic messages, lists of potential future victims, and even eerie reflections on the terror and thrill felt during each murder. Josh's influence seemed more minimal than Lily had tried to make it appear. Rather than a man who forced her hand, he looked to be a willing participant in plans she had initiated and detailed in writing. The investigators' suspicions of Lily's primary involvement were strengthened when autopsy results provided a chilling new detail. One of the victims had been tortured in a way that suggested a degree of knowledge about the human body. Cuts were made with precision, indicating an awareness of how to inflict maximum pain without quickly killing the victim. When questioned, neighbors revealed that Lily had once pursued a nursing degree, but had dropped out in her final year. This raised a disturbing possibility. Did Lily's medical training help her prolong the suffering of her victims? Forensic specialists analyzed text exchanges between Lily and Josh that had been extracted from their confiscated phones. While their conversations were riddled with strange code words and cryptic phrases, there was a chilling consistency in their language, a shared obsession with violence, punctuated by details that could only have been known by someone who had been present at the scenes of the crimes. In one particularly disturbing message, Lily had written to Josh about the finality of the fourth victim, calling it the crescendo. Days later, a disheveled Lily sat across from detectives in an interrogation room, her demeanor shifting from the pleading, terrified persona she had initially displayed. Her responses were guarded and contradictory. She claimed to barely remember any details, blaming the trauma and the fear that Josh had instilled in her. But the detectives had learned enough. Every attempt Lily made to deny her involvement only further solidified the role she had taken in these chilling murders. Her alibi had been carefully curated, but the evidence betrayed her intentions. By the end of the interrogation, the case had shifted. Lily was no longer viewed as a victim, but as a key player in a series of heinous crimes. Detectives could see the layers of manipulation in her every word, but the truth behind her motivations remained elusive. This much was certain: Lily Walters was not merely an accomplice. She was a mastermind wrapped in the guise of a victim, and her web of deceit was finally beginning to unravel. As the investigation progressed, detectives began to probe deeper into Lily Walters' past, looking for any clues that could explain her evolution from a quiet, reserved woman to someone complicit in a killing spree. The life she presented to the world had been that of a small-town woman, living a simple life. Raised in rural Wisconsin, Lily had grown up in a household that, according to neighbors, was stable if not overly strict. She had been an above-average student in high school and later attended a local college where she initially studied nursing. She moved to Ashford to start a new life, but her brief attempt at nursing school had ended abruptly when she dropped out in her final year, a curious choice given her apparent aptitude for the field. Detectives discovered that Lily's exit from the program had been under strained circumstances. Her professors had noted her increasing fascination with anatomy, specifically trauma-induced injuries, and her tendency to make offhand, unsettling comments. An ex-classmate recounted an incident during a lab session when Lily had openly speculated on pain thresholds in a detached, almost clinical tone that had disturbed her peers. When questioned about this during the investigation, Lily dismissed it as a misunderstanding, chalking it up to an academic curiosity that had been taken out of context. Yet these details were beginning to reveal a woman who was not merely a victim, but someone with a latent fascination for the morbid. Further investigation into her relationship with Josh Harris revealed layers of complexity and secrecy. Unlike Lily, who was described as quiet and introspective, Josh had a more troubled history. He'd grown up in a series of foster homes, bouncing from one unstable environment to another. By the time he reached adulthood, he had several minor arrests on his record for petty theft and assault. But his run-ins with the law weren't what drew him and Lily together. The two had reportedly met in an online forum that discussed true crime and macabre topics, where people shared gruesome details of historical cases and speculated on unsolved mysteries. According to chat records retrieved by forensic teams, the couple's relationship was built on shared interests in topics most people would avoid, and together, they developed an intense and troubling bond that would ultimately prove fatal for their victims. Piecing together her life, detectives began to see the underlying dark side to Lily's character. In her writings and private messages, there was a disturbing lack of empathy, a tendency to view other people as instruments of her curiosity or targets of her plans. Josh may have been a partner, but evidence increasingly indicated that Lily was the one in control, the orchestrator who provided direction, while Josh followed along as her accomplice. As detectives reconstructed the timeline of events leading up to the murders, they noted a distinct pattern in the victims Lily and Josh selected. Each woman fit a similar profile: young, financially independent, without significant family ties nearby. This wasn't coincidental, it was a selection criterion that reduced the risk of attention or interference from concerned relatives. In Lily's journals, detectives discovered notes outlining possible routines of the victims, including details about where they worked, the routes they took home, and even the specific nights they tended to be alone. Each entry revealed a chilling level of preparation, a logistical mind planning not only for execution but for evasion. One entry stood out for its detail on Sarah McKinney, the first victim. Sarah, a 28-year-old teacher new to Ashford, had moved from out of state and lived alone in a modest apartment. According to Lily's notes, Sarah was observed for weeks. In her journals, Lily coldly described the woman's habits, her late-night walks, and her weekend trips out of town. Lily had documented everything about her target, from her daily routines to her choice in coffee shops. Detectives were horrified by the clinical tone of Lily's descriptions, as though Sarah was little more than an object of study. Interviews with Lily's neighbors only further complicated the picture. Many of them recalled Lily as a quiet, seemingly polite woman who kept to herself, often seen on her porch, reading thick medical texts or taking notes. It was only after Josh moved in that neighbors started noticing a change in her demeanor. She became more reclusive, avoided eye contact, and would retreat indoors if anyone approached. To those who barely knew her, it seemed plausible that she was a woman living under the influence of a troubled man, and in some ways she played that role to perfection. But the digital trail told a different story. Analysis of her and Josh's online activity showed that Lily had often been the instigator, drawing Josh deeper into a disturbing subculture and suggesting that the crimes could serve as an experiment. To her, the victims weren't individuals, but rather pieces in a larger design. The police uncovered chilling emails and chat records where she referred to the victims in abstract terms like subjects or the four. Her language revealed an attitude toward the crimes that was detached and methodical, contrasting starkly with the victimized persona she had presented in her confession. Perhaps most damning was a private blog hidden on a niche server that Lily had kept under a pseudonym. There, she chronicled her experiences with Josh, expressing a sense of excitement and superiority that was unmistakable. Her words spoke of feeling invincible and having a rare clarity that set her apart. To Lily, the victims were tests of her will, opportunities to prove her control over life and death. The blog entries painted a portrait of a woman far more involved and calculating than she had initially claimed. It was this disturbing evidence that ultimately shattered the narrative she had constructed. Detectives now saw Lily not as a woman dragged into horror by a domineering partner, but as a person whose thirst for control and desire to experience fear firsthand had transformed her into a killer. She may have played the role of a subdued, vulnerable woman in public, but privately Lily Walters was a predator. As the weight of the evidence began to close in, the investigation team knew they had to tread carefully. They were dealing with a person who not only participated in a series of brutal murders, but had also manipulated those around her to cover her tracks. With the evidence mounting against Lily Walters, the prosecution began to build a rock-solid case, determined to ensure that her manipulative facade wouldn't fool a jury. Yet, despite her lies and conflicting statements, Lily held fast to her story of coercion. She insisted Josh Harris had been the true orchestrator, while she was merely a frightened, unwilling accomplice. Investigators weren't buying it. They believed they had uncovered something far more sinister, a partnership in which Lily was the instigator, the puppet master pulling the strings. The mountain of evidence they'd unearthed didn't merely incriminate her, it painted a twisted picture of a woman reveling in her crimes, confident in her ability to evade suspicion. The deeper detectives dug, the more they discovered a disturbing similarity in the way Lily had ensnared Josh, playing on his vulnerability and need for connection. Friends and former associates of Josh painted a picture of a troubled young man who had always craved acceptance, bouncing through foster homes and toxic friendships. He had a history of minor offenses, but no one who knew him suspected he was capable of murder, at least not until he met Lily. Friends remembered how his personality began to shift after their relationship started, how he became withdrawn and developed a fascination with violent crime, an obsession that previously had not been part of his character. In the eyes of detectives, Josh's troubled past made him a perfect target for someone like Lily, someone with a manipulative streak who could mold him into the accomplice she needed. By now, Lily's journal entries and private blog had revealed her as a woman whose allure lay not in her charisma, but in her cunning. She had a knack for understanding human weakness, detecting insecurity, and exploiting it. Josh Harris wasn't just a partner in crime. He had been her instrument. Investigators believed she'd drawn him in through a mixture of flattery and fear, convincing him they were bonded in ways no one else could understand. Together, she would tell him they could feel alive, experience the thrill of fear and power that others only fantasized about. She offered him a kind of connection he had never known, a darkly seductive companionship fueled by shared violence. With each new revelation, the case against Lily grew stronger. The prosecution now had a clear direction. They would argue that Lily was the mastermind, the calculating manipulator who exploited Josh's vulnerabilities, feeding him a twisted vision of love that involved committing unimaginable acts. But while the prosecution prepared its case, the public narrative was beginning to shift. Word of Lily's alleged manipulation of Josh leaked to the press, and public opinion divided. Some believed she was a monster, a woman who had knowingly masterminded the deaths of 4 innocent women. Others wondered if there was some truth to her story. Could she have been brainwashed by a dangerous, unstable partner? The media frenzy continued as both sides debated the true nature of Lily's guilt, but the detectives who had pored over the evidence felt certain this wasn't about coercion or fear. It was about a woman whose need for control had spiraled into something dark and deadly. The trial began in October 2018 in a crowded courtroom with media coverage capturing every detail. The prosecution presented their case first, confident in the mountain of evidence they had amassed. They showed the jury the harrowing details of the crime scenes, the disturbing journal entries, and the digital trail that revealed Lily's fascination with fear and violence. In chilling detail, prosecutors walked the jury through each murder, drawing clear connections between Lily's notes and the reality of each victim's fate. The evidence was laid out plainly. This was not a woman cowering under the thumb of a brutal partner, but someone actively orchestrating each step. The prosecution emphasized the meticulousness with which the crimes had been carried out. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was a calendar found in Lily's possession, on which certain dates were marked, including the dates of the murders. Each date had cryptic annotations like trial run, perfect silence, and female, suggesting she had planned the attacks with chilling forethought. Forensic experts testified that her notes displayed a keen understanding of human anatomy, lending weight to the idea that her brief training in nursing had played a direct role in the methodical manner of the killings. The defense, however, mounted an impassioned counter-narrative, one that leaned heavily on Lily's relationship with Josh and her alleged victimization. They argued that her confessions to police had been coerced, that she was traumatized, struggling to process what had happened, and had been left alone to shoulder the blame after Josh's suicide. They portrayed Josh as a violent sociopath, prone to outbursts and fits of rage, and argued that Lily had been manipulated through intimidation and psychological control. They called psychologists to testify on the long-term impacts of emotional abuse, hoping to sway the jury by suggesting that Lily's mind was too broken and fearful to resist Josh's demands. The defense's portrayal of Josh painted him as a monster who had forced Lily into complicity. But in a move that shocked the courtroom, the prosecution introduced additional chat logs recovered from Josh's computer. These records showed conversations in which Lily appeared as the dominant personality, encouraging Josh's dark interests and feeding him ideas about their so-called bond of fear. One conversation from just days before the first murder showed Lily reassuring Josh that he had nothing to fear, telling him to embrace the darkness, and promising that their actions would give them a bond untouchable by anyone else. As these details emerged, it became harder for anyone to view Lily as a mere victim. The prosecution's case had painted a picture of a woman who, through a careful combination of manipulation and planning, had masterminded a string of killings and wrapped herself in an air of helplessness to evade accountability. The defense struggled to shift the focus back to Lily's alleged trauma, but with every new piece of evidence, their case grew weaker. As the trial reached its conclusion, it was clear that the jury would have to decide between two starkly different portraits of Lily Walters. Was she a fearful woman coerced into violence, or was she the cold and calculating mastermind who had chosen her victims carefully and orchestrated their deaths with precision? The prosecution's closing argument delivered a damning assessment, reminding the jury of the female note on her calendar, the disturbing entries in her journal, and the way she had systematically deceived her friends, neighbors, and even the police. Lily, they argued, was not an unwilling accomplice but a predator in plain sight. Her carefully constructed facade had shattered, and what lay beneath was a person driven by control, cruelty, and an insatiable thirst for power. The jury deliberated for 3 tense days. Public interest in the case reached a fever pitch as people across the country speculated on the outcome. Finally, the verdict came in. Lily Walters was found guilty on all counts of murder, sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Following her sentencing, Lily Walters was transferred to Blackwater Correctional Facility, a maximum security prison reserved for some of the country's most dangerous criminals. Blackwater had a reputation as a harsh, unyielding place, remote, isolated, and tightly controlled. Inmates rarely had contact with the outside world and even less frequently with each other. Lily's arrival there symbolized the end of her reign of terror over Ashford, yet in some ways her notoriety persisted. Inside, inmates knew of her crimes, and the guards were acutely aware of her reputation as a master manipulator. Her cell was small and stark, with little more than a narrow cot, a metal toilet, and a slit of a window. For a woman who had once manipulated others for a sense of power, the restrictions of prison life stripped her of all control. She was now another inmate, confined, observed, and deprived of the freedom she had taken for granted. Initially, she tried to project the same image she'd presented in court, a helpless woman forced into a life of crime by her dangerous partner. She even requested a psychological evaluation, claiming she suffered from trauma due to her relationship with Josh Harris. But the prison staff knew her story, and few were sympathetic. Despite her attempts to charm and manipulate, the psychological evaluation painted a damning profile. Psychologists noted that her answers in interviews were cold, calculated, and largely devoid of true remorse. She spoke of her crimes with a detachment that disturbed even seasoned professionals, describing the events as though they were abstract scenarios rather than real lives lost. Her attempts to evoke pity were dismissed by the prison's mental health professionals, who saw through her carefully crafted facade. The diagnosis was clear. She exhibited characteristics of psychopathy, a woman capable of empathy only when it served her purpose. Over time, as her strategies failed to win her any sympathy, Lily grew isolated, stewing in the bitterness of her failed manipulations. The notoriety she once enjoyed had turned on her. Even among hardened criminals, she was treated as an outcast. Other inmates avoided her, viewing her as untrustworthy, someone who would turn on them if given the chance. There were whispers about the lengths she had gone to control and hurt others, tales that circulated in hushed voices among the prisoners. Lily was learning slowly and painfully that her days of manipulation were over. Months turned into years, and the outside world moved on. But Lily remained trapped in Blackwater's unyielding routine. She spent much of her time alone, a choice both forced upon her by the prison's strict segregation rules and one she gradually embraced. She kept to herself, rarely speaking to anyone and spending hours at a time scribbling in notebooks, writing down fragmented memories and thoughts. Occasionally, she wrote about the murders, reliving them as if they were stories rather than real events, analyzing each step in cold, clinical detail.